Hi, everybody. We are going to finish Roswell No Good Deed, chapters 20 through 23. Before we do that, we have a little thing we would like to mention because we used to be able to do fundraisers on our IG Lives, and with Zoom, we can't really do that. So I have my friend Allison who'd like to talk a little bit about something that she's helping fundraise for.
All right, guys. I had a friend that recently passed away. She had a condition called scleroderma. It's like a rare skin disorder. She ended up going into kidney failure, and she passed away Thursday. So the family has posted a link for donations for her funeral, which will be on the 28th. And if anyone is able, I have a Cash App here that's going to the family, and it is the money symbol, and then Albertine, which is ALBERTEEN, and then D, and then I'll write it in the chat as well in case anyone wants to like copy and paste it. So that was it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. So for our first of the last three chapters of No Good Deed, we're gonna have Michelle read first.
All right, chapter 20. March 25th, Florence Junction, Arizona. Max, Liz said. Thank heavens you're all right. All right? Nyla shook her head. She felt like she was waking from a deep sleep. Why wouldn't Max be all right? He was sitting right next to her. Only he wasn't. He was outside the car and Liz was hugging him. Tess had gotten out of the car and was going to his side. Had Nyla fallen asleep? Everything looked different. The moon was gone and the sky was dark, the way it got just before the sun started to rise. She rubbed her eyes, not feeling like herself at all. Then she glanced at the mocha. Had those kids spiked it somehow? Over-the-counter sleeping pills really knocked her out. That would have been a dangerous thing to do, but not something she would have put past Max Evans. He would have done it after they got to this place, then waited for her to fall asleep before going down to the house and confronting those scam artists or helping them escape. Nyla cursed and got out of the car. What's going on? Max looked over at her above Liz's head. Tess stood beside him and seemed both tired and smug. Max slipped out of Liz's hug and walked towards Nyla. He nodded over his shoulder down the road. Nyla looked in the direction he indicated and saw another car. It had clearly been parked there for a long time, and she had somehow missed it. What are you doing? She asked. Michael got here a little while ago, Max said. You were already asleep, so we decided to go down to the cabin ourselves. Asleep? She shivered. She didn't like the confirmation of her suspicions. How far is the cabin? When you and I walked down there, we couldn't see anything. Max frowned at her. You said you wanted to close your eyes just for a minute when we stopped. I realized you were asleep when the truck went down the driveway and you didn't even notice. Michael was right behind him. She blinked, confused. She never fell asleep on a stakeout. She'd once sat with cops for 2 days. They had relief, but she hadn't, and she'd managed to be awake the entire time. She'd felt awake this time. She'd had enough caffeine and sugar to keep her fueled for days, unless he'd put something in the coffee like she suspected. She'd have to have it checked out when she got back to Phoenix. Michael and I managed to tie up your scam artists, Max said. Come on, there's some stuff down in that cabin you need to see. Wait a minute, Nyla said. Why should I believe this wasn't just staged for my benefit, that you're somehow in league with these guys? Max gave her that level stare that he always gave her when he wasn't going to answer questions. Believe what you want. Max, Tess said. He shrugged. She wanted a story. She doesn't have to have it. Do you still have your phone, Liz? We need to call the cops. Right here, Liz said, patting her purse, but not taking it out. Wait, Nyla said. What story? I'll show you. Max started down the road, then paused. But before we go too far, I need a promise from you. What's that? Nyla asked. First, he said, you'll wait here until we're gone before calling the police. When they get here, you won't mention any of us, not me, Michael, Liz, or Tess. You took care of these guys. We didn't. You got that? The police aren't going to believe that, Nyla said. That's not my problem, Max said, because if you don't agree to my terms, I'm setting these guys free, destroying the serum and their files and getting out of here. I thought you just told Liz to call the cops, Nyla said. I changed my mind. Max had a low, calm way of speaking that conveyed a sense of utter conviction. I can't trust you, and if I can't trust you, I can't trust that you'll keep our names out of this. You'd let criminals go free because of that? Nyla asked. Yes, Max said. Nyla sighed. This boy, this young man, this powerful young man had her over a barrel every time she turned around. All right, what else? You won't mention us in connection to the Phoenix Hospital and to the December 24th event. Event? He didn't call it a miracle. He called it an event. I already made that promise, she said. No, he said. You said you wouldn't give us to the police, and you said you wouldn't mention our names. I don't want you to mention us at all. You're part of it, she said. You and your friend Michael are known to the police. People know that you went into that room and that you disappeared from there. And that's all they need to know. All right, she said. But I'd like to know. I think you owe me that. For what? He asked. Taking us across state lines? 3 underage kids whom you just met this morning? What? Her eyes widened. He gave her a small smile. Those are the facts, Miss Spence. You drove 3 underage kids across state lines today. That you did it for a good reason doesn't change the fact that you did it without talking to her parents and without legal permission. Think of what a person in command of those facts could do with them. You would look pretty bad. Why would you do that to me? I didn't say I would, he said, any more than you said you'd misuse the facts about the Phoenix Hospital. But just by putting those facts out there, there's a risk of misinterpretation. Don't you agree? You're afraid I'll use whatever you tell me in the article, she asked. After the article's in print, what recourse would I have? You have to trust me at some point. Max's small smile grew. I do trust you. I came with you. I brought my friends. We will give you a story if you want. My dogs are going crazy. I'm sorry. We will give you a story if you want. One that I think will make a difference. Isn't that enough? Where did this kid get his composure? She talked to high-level, white-collar criminals who didn't have Max's smarts or his guts. And she talked to politicians who would kill for Max's negotiating skills and his inventiveness. Well, Max asked. Deal, she said, although I'm still not sure how you boxed me into this position. You boxed yourself, Miss Spence, he said as he headed to the car, and she knew it was true. Never once did she have the upper hand in any of this. She always wanted information from Max. He didn't claim to want anything from her. Until now. And he'd had enough time to prepare for that. So even if she had objections, he still had the upper hand. Max got into the car, so did Tess and Liz. It took Nyla a moment to realize she was supposed to drive them down the driveway.
On to chapter 21. March 25th, Florence Junction, Arizona. Max sat rigidly in the front seat of the car. His heart was pounding. Nyla Spence had agreed to all of his terms. He hadn't expected her to. He had thought there was a good possibility that he would have to hold her, then leave without giving her those guys, and then have to contact the police anonymously. He was glad that hadn't happened. This would be easier by a long shot. Nyla was driving down the dirt road, her eyes wide as if she'd never seen it before. He wondered what kind of image Tess had given her when she actually stood on the road earlier. He had thought it strange that Nyla accepted his explanation of sleep so readily. Apparently, Tess had done better than he had thought she would. He had told her that he thought they would have to lie to Nyla and make her think she'd been asleep. Apparently, Tess had messed with things just enough so that Nyla believed everything she had seen in the last few hours had been a dream. Thank heaven she'd been so easy to convince. Max had actually expected to have a tougher time of it. But as he was beginning to learn, people usually accepted the mundane explanations of things. If something extraordinary happened in front of them, they were unwilling to believe it. They didn't want to know that aliens really existed, that their perceptions of reality could be altered, that the world wasn't always the way it seemed. He guessed reporters were probably more vulnerable to that than most folks. Investigative reporters, like Nyla Spence, saw the gritty underside of things. To learn that fantastic things were possible would probably mess with the grim realities of her life. She had to be able to see those things clearly to survive. Anything else would be merely details. She pulled the car up behind the truck. The house looked different with all the lights on. It would have looked welcoming if it weren't for the open front door and the 2 men tied up in the entryway. Oh, Max, Liz said. I didn't even ask if you were all right. Of course he's fine, Tess said. I'm fine, Max said, as if Tess hadn't spoken. Sometimes her proprietary attitude towards him irritated him, especially when it was directed towards Liz. Nyla got out of the car. So did Max. He could see Michael through the window. He was standing near the tied-up men. Michael had straightened the guy's clearly broken leg to make them look less pounded. Good job, Max thought. That way Nyla wouldn't know they had even touched the computer, but he would have to make sure Michael had the disk he'd been saving. Liz and Tess got out too. Liz was standing right behind him. Can you tell me what was in that serum if they were making? Not without a lab, she said. Just a guess is all we need, I think. I'll have someone test the stuff, Nyla said. I doubt I'll read your story, Max said to her, and started up the stairs and into the house. Nyla followed. So did Tess and Liz. Michael stepped forward as they approached. Any troubles? Max asked. Sleeping like babies, Michael said. He stared at Nyla. So you're the famous reporter, and you're the missing Michael. Max noticed that she was small next to him, but she looked really tough. Your friends were really worried about you today, she said. He gave her a sardonic smile. I'm sure that attracted you like blood attracts a shark. Michael, Liz said. He looked at her for the first time. I thought you were worried about me. I was. She went over to him and hugged him. Just don't mess with a reporter. She said that loudly enough for everyone to hear. Nyla gave a rueful laugh. I'm glad someone around here respects me. If I didn't respect you, Max said, I wouldn't have brought you down here. Point taken. Nyla stared at the entire room, taking a few extra moments to stare at the two men. I'm going to need my camera. After we leave, Tess said. The serum, Max said to Liz. All the stuff is in the kitchen, Michael said. Liz nodded and headed in that direction. Careful to not leave any fingerprints on anything, Max said. He glanced at Nyla and Tess to make sure they understood as well. Nyla hadn't moved since she entered the room. Somehow I would have thought this place would have been more torn up. That guy down there is big, and you two don't look like you do well on WWF SmackDown. Michael rolled his eyes. Max shrugged, giving it a moment's thought on how to answer that. Finally, he just said, sometimes you get lucky. With them having guns, she asked, pointing at the guns still under the table. Max said nothing. The less he said, the better they would all be. Tess shook her head and walked out to the porch. Max understood. She didn't want to say because she was afraid of what she might say. Max nodded towards the computer. You told me they did everything by email. I'm assuming that's your gold mine. The money is hidden in the hallway. I hope you and the police will get it back to the rightful owners. He glanced at Michael and he patted his pocket where the disc would be. Good. I'll make sure it happens, Nyla said. Was there any serum left in that kitchen? It would be good to have some. I don't think we should mess with this stuff too much, Max said. We want the police to be able to make a complete case. There's serum in my car, Michael said. I'll give it to you before we leave. Max looked at him in surprise. Michael shrugged. What am I supposed to do with it? How did you get it? Nyla asked. That's a question you shouldn't ask, Max said, before Michael could answer. At that moment, Liz came out of the kitchen. Her eyes were dark coals in her face, and her mouth formed a thin line. Cough syrup and sugar water, she said. Are you sure? Max asked. There wasn't anything else in there. Liz's cheeks were flushed too. She was as angry as he'd ever seen her. Bottles of the stuff, all different. They mixed the cough syrups and gave it to sick children. That's bad, right? Michael asked. I had a hunch that whatever they were doing was bad for the kids. It was worse than if they'd just done sugar water, Liz said, her voice barely containing the anger. How much worse? Max asked. He had to know. Have you ever read the warning label on cough syrup? She asked. Don't use it if you're pregnant or have heart disease or high blood pressure or diabetes. And all cough syrups have different ingredients. Drugs interact with each other. Who knows what this stuff was doing? It certainly wasn't harmless, even if it had been taken by a healthy adult. I don't want to think about what it did to sick children. Max's stomach cramped up. That was exactly what he didn't want to hear. Liz stopped in front of the two men, still unconscious on the floor. For a moment, Max thought she was going to kick them, but she didn't. He wouldn't have blamed her if she had. Finally, she just sort of growled at them, and then went outside to join Tess. I don't like this, Michael, Max said. We stopped them, Michael said. But was it too late? Michael looked off into the distance. I don't know, he said softly. I hope not. Max stared at him for a moment, wondering what really happened in the last 24 hours. But he knew that Michael wouldn't tell him as long as the reporter was around. I think we should get out of here, Max said. Michael nodded. He joined the girls outside on the porch. Max walked over to Nyla. She had shut off the screensaver and was staring at the computer's menu. We have a deal? He asked again. Yes, she said, not looking at him. All right. He reached into his pocket and handed her her phone. Tess had taken it from her earlier and had given it to him. She stared at the phone like it was a snake. I don't know how long it'll take the police to get here, but I suspect it might be a while. Those guys are well tied up, and Michael and I took their guns away from them. But you don't want to be alone when they wake up. They probably won't be the most agreeable company. He knew for a fact they were going to be in a lot of pain, but he didn't mention that to her. Nyla pulled her gaze away from the phone in her hand to look at the tied-up men. She took a deep breath. Before she turned the phone on, she looked up at Max. You'd better get out of here before I call. It would be just our luck to have the police respond instantly. Max smiled at her. Michael will leave the serum on the turnout. All right, she said. Then she extended her hand. Nice doing business with you, Mr. Evans. He took her hand. Her grip was firm, her expression filled with respect. Likewise, Miss Spence. Then he joined his friends on the porch. As the four of them walked up the dirt road towards Michael's car, Max noted that a thread of light lined the eastern horizon. It was dawn. Time to leave. It's chapter 21. So we are on to 22.
Chapter 22, March 25, outside of Florence Junction, Arizona. Sometimes Liz didn't understand Tess. As they got into the car, Michael had parked on the shoulder. Tess got into the passenger seat so that she was sitting beside Michael. Liz had said that she should sit in the back with Max, and Tess had nodded her head yes. You should, she had said, and then settled in the front. Max didn't seem to notice any of it. He sat in the back seat and stared out the window as Michael headed the car up the road towards Tucson and told them what had happened to him. As Michael talked, answering a few questions, Max just sat beside Liz, turning a computer disk Michael had given him over and over in his hand. Michael occasionally looked into the rearview mirror and frowned. What are you going to do with that disk, Maxwell? He finally asked. Insurance, Max said. Liz frowned, not at all certain about what was happening. What's on the disk? The name of all the families who were scammed, Michael said. Liz felt her breath catch. She remembered the look on Max's face when he had told her about saving Sydney, about the way he couldn't just abandon all those other sick children. What kind of insurance? Tess asked. In case Nyla Spence didn't live up to her side of the bargain? Yeah, Max said. But Liz wasn't convinced by his tone. I'll send this anonymously to the police if I have to. These guys need to go away for life. They will, Michael said with such fury that Liz didn't doubt it. Liz knew that without a doubt, if the police didn't put them away, Michael would do whatever needed to be done. He was that angry. They drove for a while in silence. Max continued to stare out the window. As they passed through a small town, the store lights illuminated his face. Liz recognised the expression. It was the same one he'd had when he'd come to her window on Christmas Eve and told her about the children. She slipped her hand through his. He looked at her in surprise. You can't do that, you know, she said, keeping her voice soft and as comforting as she could. Tess looked at them over the car seat and, to Liz's surprise, smiled. Was this what Tess wanted? Someone to make sure that Max wouldn't do something stupid? It's my fault, Max said. None of these kids would be in this situation if I hadn't gone to the hospital in Phoenix that night and the press hadn't called it a miracle. No, Max, Liz said. That's wrong. Michael glanced into the rearview mirror this time and Liz thought she saw relief on his face. He seemed to be worried about Max doing something too. And if Michael had the right to worry, he was taking Max to a hospital in Tucson to save the life of a little girl. It was December 24th all over again. Only this time Tess said she'd make sure no one knew they were there and no one remembered them. Liz could only hope that Tess's powers weren't drained by her time spent controlling Nyla Spence. It's not wrong, Liz, Max said. It's what I have to do. Liz shook her head and focused on Max. No, I mean your assumption is wrong. He looked down at their hands clasped on the car seat. It's not your fault that these children are ill. They were ill when their parents contacted the scam artists. The medicine might have made them worse, but all the parents had to do was take them back to the hospital with a sample. The doctors would know what to do. But that's why the parents went to these guys in the first place, Max said, because they thought the hospitals weren't helping. Liz sighed. Sometimes no matter what we do, no matter how many powers we have, people die, Max. He gripped her hand hard. I won't let that happen, not to anyone I care about. She put her free hand over their clasped hands. You might not have a choice. He looked at her. Remember what I said to you on Christmas Eve? He nodded and looked away. I can't believe that innocent children getting ill is part of some benevolent God's plan. I don't think you were placed here to perform miracles, Max, Liz said. Think of what would happen if the word got out. You handled Nyla Spence, but she had ethics. Imagine reporters who don't. Max winced. And think of all the people who would claim they knew you or could do what you did. These men took advantage of your good deed. If you did 100 more things like this, imagine what would happen then. Max shook his head. I can't think what other people will do. I'm only responsible for what I do, Liz. She nodded. I know that, but sometimes you have to trust that the system will work. We're on the verge of a revolution in medicine, Max. You have no idea how sick these kids are. Maybe even as we speak, some doctor is making them well. Max's eyes were dark, haunted. I'll never forget that night, Liz. I couldn't just leave them. You're not, she said. You're not leaving any of these children either. The police and Nyla Spence will get to the parents. They'll get treatment if the serum made them sicker, and you'll probably get the kids the right kind of help because of it. It'll probably scare them enough that they'll never try something this risky again. Max sighed. I know you're right. You need to rest, Liz said. This is one little girl that you're going to help, but she's not too far from here. You want to be at your best. Yeah, Max said softly. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back. In the front seat, Michael nodded, and Tess let out a slight sigh. Liz watched Max for a moment, praying that the little girl whose father had kidnapped Michael, the little girl who had ridden in the backseat of this very car, had a room all to herself. Because the one thing Liz didn't say to Max, the thing none of them could say to Max, was how scared they had all been the way he had drained his powers that night. She didn't want him to do that again. March 25th, somewhere between Benson and Tucson, Arizona. Okay, Maria said as she set her purse on the car seat beside her. Does anyone want to tell me the point of spending the night outside a diner called Pie and Stuff? Why didn't Michael just tell us to meet him in bloody Tucson again in the first place? You should have asked him, Isabel said. She was in the back seat, her head back, eyes closed. She sounded exhausted. I did ask him, Maria said. Didn't you hear me ask him? He said he would all be clear when we get there. Does that make any sense to any of you? Am I the only one who's concerned that we're meeting all four of them at a hospital? Valenti said. He was driving as casually as he had before, one hand on the wheel, the other on the stick, but Maria noticed that his speed was a notch or two higher than it should have been. He sounded fine, didn't he? Alex said. Max is with him, Isabel still hadn't opened her eyes. I'm not worried now. Neither was Maria, but now that the worry was gone, irritation had taken its place. Michael had led them on some weird wild goose chase, and he hadn't explained any of it yet. I'm cold and I'm tired, and we didn't even have breakfast, she said. I offered to buy you something at 4 a.m., Alex said patiently. You said you weren't hungry. I was worried, Maria said. How can anyone eat when they're worried? Alex did, Isabel said. I wasn't the only one. You both did too. Alex looked from her to Valenti. I didn't, Maria said. We can stop and get something, Valenti said. No, Maria crossed her arms. If we miss him again, he might make us go to Grand Canyon or something. Maybe this is just one big game to him. I doubt it, Alex said. Why do you men always stick together? Maria asked him. Don't answer that, Valenti said. See? Maria looked at Isabel. They're doing it now. No, they're not, Isabel said, because I'm with them. Just relax, Maria. He's fine. He's fine. You're all so certain he's fine. She flounced back in the seat and looked at the mile markers. Only 1 mile since the last time she looked. This trip was going to take forever, which was probably a good thing, since she had to figure out what kind of reaction she'd have when she saw Michael. She would want to hug him, but she wasn't sure he deserved a hug. After all, he stood her up, forgotten to call her, made her drive to nowhere, Arizona, without explanation, and then made her wait all night. On the other hand, he called as soon as he could, and he had called her, not Max, and he had a good excuse for standing her up. Maybe he even had a good excuse for not meeting her in nowhere, Arizona. She'd have to wait and see. She shook her head. Michael, he was really the most exasperating person in the world, which was one of the things that made him so interesting and attractive. A hug, she smiled. Definitely a hug first. Then she'd react, depending. She settled back in her seat, feeling better now that she had a reaction all planned. March 25th, Tucson, Arizona. The hospital was very quiet. It wasn't even 5 a.m., although it seemed a lot later. The sun had just crept over the horizon, but it had been lighting the sky for some time now. Michael hadn't realized how exhausted he was until he went to the emergency room and found one of the night nurses. Katie Newcomb, he'd asked. I'm her brother. She's upstairs, the nurse had said, and had given him a room number. So now he, Max, Liz, and Tess were walking down the corridor as if they belonged there. No nurse stopped them, and no one noticed them. This time he was very aware of the hospital security cameras. Tess couldn't do anything about that, but he might be able to, if he had to. If someone was in Katie's room, if people figured out there was a miracle, Michael couldn't tell Liz didn't think this was a good idea. He didn't either, but he had no other choice. That little girl had nearly died because of him. And for all the pretty speeches that Liz had given Max, Max really was right. It didn't matter once you saw the child's face. From that point on, you did everything you could to save her. Fortunately, Max understood that. When Michael had told him what he wanted to do, Max hadn't hesitated. They arrived at Katie's room. It was a private room with a large Bugs Bunny painted on the door. Through the small window, Michael could see Chad Newcomb sitting in the chair beside the bed. Michael let out a small sigh. At least Katie was still alive. He'd been terrified they'd lost her during the night. He and Max had agreed that they would wait outside the room while Michael found out what was going on. Maybe Michael could even get Newcomb to leave. He braced himself, then pushed open the door. Newcomb looked up. How is she? Michael asked. The smile on Newcomb's face as he stood was like nothing Michael had ever seen. She's going to be fine. They finally found out what was wrong. Michael stared. Newcomb went on, his smile growing. She had a very rare virus that attacks the heart. It's very rare in children, maybe one case in a million. But this emergency room doctor had interned with some specialists on it and recognised it. No one thought to test for it. He doubted anyone had ever seen a case like it in Arizona. Michael's head spun. He was tired. He wasn't sure what Newcomb was saying. So she's going to recover? She'll need attention for a few more days, but yes, she will. Thank you for forcing me to come here. The words rocked Michael. What? Newcomb stood and reached out his hand. I hope you will forgive me for hitting you and taking you from your home. I was desperate and stupid. Michael stared at Newcomb's hand. After a moment, he took it. Michael was beginning to understand the desperation that motivated the man. Katie is going to be all right, Michael said. That's all that's important. You have every right to have me arrested, Newcomb said, staring into Michael's eyes. I won't mention a word of it, Michael said. If you don't mention me when the police contact you about the internet fraud and me borrowing your car for a few hours. Those guys are out of business now. It looks like they're going to get your money back. Newcomb smiled. I'd have spent every nickel I had for this night to happen. I didn't know how you did it, but you have a deal. Michael then reached into his pocket and handed Newcomb the car keys. Newcomb then stared for a moment as if a reminder of his stupidity. Finally, he brightened. You want to see Katie? Yeah, Michael said. Both he and Newcomb moved to the side of the bed. Katie was asleep, as she had been most of the time he'd been with her. Tubes covered her arms and a monitor was attached to her chest. Yet even with all the equipment, she looked better. Her skin colour was almost normal. She didn't seem as frail as she had just a few hours before. She's beautiful, Michael said. Newcomb smiled. She looks like her mother. For a while, I thought I lost both of them. Michael thought about Maria and how it would feel to lose her. Then he shook his head. Maybe he hadn't completely understood Newcomb's desperation after all. Mind if I stay here for a few minutes? Michael asked. Not at all, Newcomb said. After all, you saved her life. Without using his powers. Without doing anything except the right thing. He'd finally gotten his wish. He'd finally been able to help someone without relying on Max. Without relying on anyone but himself. Michael looked down at Katie, who was going to be just fine, and realised he'd never felt better in his life. Done.
You so
I can see chat popping up and I'm like, what are people writing? I'm not going to look because they're probably paying out what I'm saying.
People loved your accent, and I loved when you said bloody Tucson. I thought it was hilarious.
Oh, because I was like, how many times do I have that bloody word? I don't know how to pronounce. Fuck. So anyway.
That's right. You're right.
I was like, Tucson, Arizona. Then I'm like, no, Tucson. Then I'm like, I don't know. I just have to roll with it.
You're right.
Some people were saying Tuscan. It's like, it's all those.
Tuscan.
You can pronounce it any
One of
way.
those. And I
Depends
kept
on where you're
saying
from.
Nyla or Nyla, I don't know, and I couldn't remember how Michelle pronounced it, and I was like, whatever, just go with it. It's whatever.
I was just like, why can't it be called Nowhere, Arizona? That would be better than that other word. Anyway. Why can't they be not in Arizona and somewhere in New Mexico I can pronounce? Anyway, it's over. It's done.
Who said, I'm trying to look, somebody said you should do audiobooks. So
Yes, somebody did say that, Sophie.
Oh, God. I don't think so.
well, what y'all think of the book?
It's good.
Told you it was a good one.
I'm sorry, I'm just seeing King Michael, and I'm like, I agree with anything that says that. Hey, see, I was just explaining earlier that the Other Half Lives episode. I'm like, if anyone ever asks why Michael's my favorite, that's a good episode to start on. He saves the day in that one. See?
Yeah,
Sorry,
you probably really like this book, Allison.
Yeah. I do like it. I do like it. Every time we read it, I love it.
Yeah.
Or when you guys are reading it, I love it.
Did you guys watch the Crystal episodes today?
Yeah, we did.
Watch
We
how the
did.
other half lives, yes.
Yeah, we watched Other Half Lives. It
Okay,
was
perfect, because that's
great.
next.
Next week or start it now, because by Tuesday I might be out of power and Michelle would have to do the Zoom or something.
It's up to you guys. I'm available now, so it doesn't matter to me.
I probably will only be able to be on here for another like 20 minutes. I would say starting it next week, even if we don't do Tuesday on Sunday.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if you guys haven't sent me your address, send me your address so I can send you guys a pin if you're not on my
Thanks
list.
again, Jess, for that. I'm excited.
Yeah, send me all those. I've had people reach out from everywhere. I have so much requests for it. I have to buy more supplies. So bear with me getting them to you guys, okay?
No worries.
So-
I'm excited.
I didn't realize it was that big, Christy. That's why I asked you. I'm like,
Yeah,
is that
cool.
a pin you're wearing?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
I
that's
thought
my
it was
pin,
much
that's it.
smaller for some
I
I'm
don't
reason.
excited
have
because
a cool-looking
Rachel did
Roswell
my
jacket,
my
like
boss.
Michelle does. She's a cool-looking jacket, so I just put it on my.
Isn't that cool? Do you know what that is? You're never gonna guess. You know what it is? It's nail
No.
polish.
That's awesome.
Literally.
Typical. It's too cool for Roswell to be nail polish because
Well,
you know
it has
they
a
leave nail
saying.
polish.
Well, it kind of
It's a
says
Halloween
something
pin.
on the
It's
hand,
funny.
but I can't make it out.
Yeah, it has a
Um,
saying on it. It's a Halloween pin, and I painted over it in like several layers, and then I used nail polish, like silver nail polish, to get it that effect. And then I found some sparkly black to go over that to make it even more silvery.